As a cemetery manager, a big part of my job involves sitting down with families to arrange funerals and handle plot sales. Not too long ago, a man in his 30s named Antonio came to see me about purchasing a plot for his father, who was receiving hospice care. Antonio was a deeply spiritual man, and his thick Hispanic accent matched his gentle nature. You could tell by looking at him that he was a very caring person. He showed me a few photos of his father, a kind-looking man who seemed far too young to be leaving his family behind. Sadly, his father's time came within that same week, and Antonio made the arrangements for his funeral at the cemetery. On the day of the funeral, the weather was stormy, which some believe is a sign of good luck. The procession made a brief stop in front of the office building, so I stepped out under the awning for a moment. I spotted Antonio in his car behind the hearse, and we exchanged waves. Because of the rain, I went back inside until it was time for the procession to move toward the burial site. I followed them in one of the cemetery's pickup trucks, as part of my role involves ensuring everything runs smoothly during services. Umbrella in hand, I stood by to oversee the burial, as I always do. Afterward, I drove around the cemetery a few times, doing my usual rounds. There's always paperwork to catch up on, and that day, I had the additional responsibility of closing the cemetery later in the evening. By 5:30, when we close, it was already getting dark. The stormy weather made it feel like nighttime had arrived early, though it was only March. As I was making my final round to ensure all visitors had left, I noticed something odd. Someone seemed to be walking quickly down one of the lanes between the tombstones before disappearing behind a hedge. I honked my horn to let them know the cemetery was closing, but I didn't see them again. I grabbed my umbrella and rushed out into the rain. I went to where I'd last seen them, turning behind the hedge and looking down the long row of tombstones on one side and hedges on the other, but there was no one. I searched for about 20 minutes before giving up and heading back to the office. Once back inside, I reviewed the CCTV footage to see if the cameras had caught any unusual movement, but the rain and darkness made it difficult to see clearly. As I watched the screens, I kept an eye on my paperwork, trying to multitask, when suddenly the front door to the visitation room slammed shut. I jumped up and called out, "Hello?" I assumed it was the person I had seen earlier, maybe someone who had gotten locked inside the cemetery and was now trying to find a way out. I stepped into the lobby, but there was no one there. After searching around, I thought maybe the door slamming shut meant they had already left. Then as I was checking the windows, I froze. I saw someone on the other side of the glass staring back at me with a blank expression. Startled, I jumped and screamed, but they didn't react. It was then that I recognized the face. It looked exactly like the pictures of Antonio's father that he had shown me. My heart pounded in my chest. I ran outside, soaking in the rain, but there was no one there. The man was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. He wasn't running into the fields, hiding in the bushes. Nothing. Drenched and shaken, I hurried back inside, packed up my things, locked the building, and got into my car. After closing and locking the gate behind me, I drove home. When my wife asked why I was so quiet that evening, I just told her it had been a long day at work. Even now, I tell myself I must have been overtired, that my mind was just playing tricks on me. But it's still hard to shake the feeling that something truly unsettling happened that day. My name is Jeremy, and this took place in late October. It was cold and windy, the kind of weather that chills you to the bone. I live in a fairly large town, though it's old and rundown, with buildings dating back to the early 18th century. One night, a friend and I were bored and decided to head out at 3 a.m. I know wandering around at that time in a poor, sketchy town isn't the brightest idea, but we were looking for something to do. We got tired of driving around, blasting music. We're both hardcore metalheads, and at that time we had our own band, so we thought it might be fun and a little adventurous to walk around one of the town's cemeteries. Behind the old town square, there's a huge cemetery, split into two sides by a highway, each side covering about 20 acres. Like I said, it's massive. We chose to explore the older section of the cemetery, which is entirely separated from the newer part by a rusty iron fence and gate. We started walking around, checking out the graves, trying to read the inscriptions on the moss-covered headstones, and taking some photos. I know it was a bit disrespectful, but these graves were over a century old, so it's not like there's anyone left to care, and I doubt the people buried there would have minded too much. After about an hour, we sat down under a huge pecan tree in the center of the old section. That's when we heard it. A little girl's laugh. And it was close. At first I thought maybe it was a toy left on a child's grave or something like that. I'm not easily spooked, so I figured it was one of those motion-activated toys or some other explanation. Neither of us scares easily, so we just kind of laughed, acknowledged how creepy it was, and kept chatting, enjoying the eerie atmosphere. But then, like all stories like this, I started to get that unsettling feeling, like someone or something was watching us. I brushed it off, thinking I was just getting in my own head. But then my friend said he thought he saw someone lurking in the shadows of the wooded area right next to the cemetery. That was enough to freak us both out. So we decided it was time to leave. And then, that same laugh played again. Right after that, we heard the sound of leaves crunching under someone's feet. That's when we lost it. We took off, running as fast as we could down the hill, back to where my car was parked near the old part of the cemetery. I don't think I've ever run that fast in my life. It even felt like the laughter was following us. We didn't stop until we made it to the car. I jumped in, started it up, and pulled out onto the highway without even checking for traffic. Luckily, no one hit us. We drove down the road to the only gas station open at that time of night to check the back of my car. We'd both been talking about how we were scared someone might have messed with it. When we got out to check, we found the back doors wide open. I'm certain neither of us ever opened them, and there was no reason for them to be open. I quickly checked the back seats, made sure no one or nothing was in there, and then we got back in the car and sped off. I'm still not sure what happened that night. Maybe we overreacted, maybe not. But even now, whenever I tell this story, I still get that same creepy feeling like something's standing right behind me. When I was 19, my friend Sean, who was always a bit of a jokester, came over to hang out in our basement like he usually did during the summer. I clearly remember he had a Coke bottle in his hand while I was eating Wendy's, and out of nowhere he suggested we check out this creepy little cemetery across town. It was such a random idea that I couldn't help but tell him just that. Still, we didn't have school the next day, and I knew exactly the cemetery he was referring to. It was hard to even call it a normal cemetery. It was just a small plot of land with maybe 100 tombstones at most. The headstones were ancient-looking, and every time we passed by, it seemed like no one had visited in years. The place probably dated back centuries, and it always had this eerie vibe because it was surrounded by a Gothic metal fence, with woods on two sides, a road on another, and an old, abandoned building on the last. The whole setting just screamed creepy. After a bit of convincing, Sean got me to agree to check it out. Ironically, the sky was overcast with a strange reddish hue, which only added to the atmosphere. Sean pulled his Honda off to the side of the road, but I told him to park a little further down to avoid drawing attention, especially since this was a low-traffic area. He parked a few hundred feet down, and we cut through the woods so no passing cars would see us entering the cemetery. Jumping the fence was easy enough. It was only about 3 or 4 feet high. Sean, being the one who pushed this adventure, took the lead, guiding us through the eerie little cemetery. We started looking at the old tombstones, all dating back to the 19th century. Some of the inscriptions were so worn that they were nearly unreadable. I know it sounds cliché, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we wandered through, I kept glancing toward the woods that surrounded the cemetery. I told Sean how unsettling the whole place felt, and he agreed, but seemed less fazed than I was. Then I looked toward the abandoned building and noticed something, or rather, someone in one of the windows. Despite the fog, dirt, and grime on the glass, I was certain I saw someone standing there. But before I could fully process it, they quickly moved away from the window. I immediately told Sean that someone was in that building, and he turned to look too. Without hesitation, he began searching for a way inside. I told him we should just leave before we got into trouble, but Sean wasn't listening. He kept looking for an entrance while I stayed near one of the tombstones. A few moments later, he called me over, but I refused to go any closer. That's when I heard a loud crack, like something breaking. I turned in the direction of the sound and saw an older man, probably in his mid-50s, with gray hair, a black raincoat, jeans, and a mustache. That's all I could make out before he opened his mouth and screamed. It wasn't just a shout, it was a full-on scream. "Get out!" His voice was so loud it startled birds into flying away. Suddenly, I felt lightheaded and everything went black. The next thing I remember, I was being dragged through the woods. I panicked, thinking I was being kidnapped, but when I turned around, I saw it was just Sean. He was freaking out and told me to get up and run to the car. Without asking any questions, I followed him, and we ran as fast as we could through the woods. I could hear footsteps behind us, and when I turned back, I saw someone was following us. That made me run even faster. We reached Sean's Honda, and he didn't waste any time. He practically had the car in drive before the engine even had a chance to fully start. Once we were on the road, we sped off to the nearest gas station that was open. We both needed to calm down and check the car to make sure everything was fine. When we got out to inspect it, we immediately noticed the back doors were wide open. I knew for a fact that neither of us had opened them. There was no reason for us to. I checked the back seat to make sure no one was there, then quickly jumped back into the car and sped off. Sean later told me that when he went inside the abandoned building, he found a sigil of Baphomet painted on the floor, basically a symbol associated with Satanism. Surrounding it were a bunch of creepy dolls with buttons for eyes. He didn't stick around long enough to see anything else because he heard the old man screaming at me outside. When he came running, he found me unconscious on the ground, with the old man slowly approaching. Sean grabbed me and dragged me away, eventually throwing me over the fence to get me out. I woke up just as we were running through the woods. It was the only time I've ever fainted in my life. And the fact that it happened in a graveyard near what looked like a satanic ritual makes the whole thing even more unsettling. A few years ago, my grandpa passed away. We were always incredibly close. This past July, on his birthday, I decided to visit him at the cemetery. The cemetery where my grandparents chose to be buried is about an hour's drive from my apartment. My family lives closer, so they all went to visit his grave together. Since I had to come from farther away, I made the trip on my own. It was a rainy, dreary day. Nothing worse than visiting a cemetery on a day like that. When I got there, the gatekeeper asked for the plot number, which I gave to him, and he let me in. The cemetery is pretty large, and I'd only been there a couple of times before, but never as the one driving, so I struggled to find the exact spot. I didn't see many other people around, if any, probably because of the weather. After searching for a bit, I finally located my grandpa's grave. I parked on the grass nearby, placed some flowers at the foot of the headstone, and stood there in silence with my eyes closed, offering a prayer. When I finished praying and opened my eyes, I looked up, and there, about 5 rows of graves away, stood an old man looking directly at me. I recognized him instantly. It was my grandpa. No, it couldn't be. I rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, he was gone. Had I just experienced something spiritual, or were my eyes and mind playing tricks on me? Either way, I was chilled to the bone, goosebumps rising all over my arms. I was unnerved. I got back into my car, whispered, "Love you, Grandpa," and drove off. On the way home, I started to feel a headache coming on. Not sure why. The road I was driving on was quiet, known as Prospect Road. It cuts through dense forest on both sides, and it's a place where deer often cross. As I was driving, I noticed someone up ahead by the side of the road, which was strange because there are no sidewalks or walking paths there. I slowed down. It couldn't be, but it looked just like my grandpa again. When I realized this, my heart dropped. I panicked and accidentally swerved the car. I desperately tried to regain control and managed to stop, my car skidding out in the middle of the road. Thankfully, I didn't crash into anything, just stopped in the middle of the road. I immediately looked back to where I'd seen him, but this time, there was only a deer standing there, staring at my car. My heart was pounding, and I felt an overwhelming sense of fear. Something wasn't right with me, and I just needed to get home. I checked for other cars, got back into my lane, and drove the rest of the way home, trying to focus as best I could despite what I'd seen twice that day. I felt strange the rest of the day. Not sick, but something was off in my head. That night, I went to bed early after watching an episode of my favorite show. I woke up around 2 a.m. to my phone ringing. It was an unknown number and my heart started racing again. Calls at that hour are never good news. I answered, putting the phone to my ear. At first, all I could hear was static. "Hello?" I asked. More static. Then, just for a brief moment, I swear I heard my grandpa's voice through the static, maybe for half a second. Shaken, I tried to say hello again, but I was too rattled. My entire body was trembling. Then, the call abruptly ended, cutting to silence. The next day, I called my phone provider to trace the number, but they couldn't. They said they didn't have enough data to track it, though I'm not sure if that's true or not. Everything that happened that day and night remains the most terrifying experience I've ever had. Do I believe my grandpa was trying to contact me? I'm not sure. It sounds ridiculous, but what happened is still hard to explain. You'd think that if something like this happened, you'd be filled with emotion or joy. But no, it still scares me. I still wonder, almost every night, was that really my grandpa on the phone? When my friends and I were teenagers, we often acted foolishly. I was around 17 or 18 when this incident occurred. It was October, and in the spirit of Halloween, I wanted to do something spooky. There's a small cemetery about 10 minutes from my home, and after a few drinks with some friends, I suggested we sneak into it. I'll use fake names for my friends, Ryan and Mike. We were at Ryan's house, and since he never drank, he ended up being our designated driver to the cemetery. Mike and I were the ones leading the charge, while Ryan was just tagging along, having stayed sober. Ryan parked in a lot across the street, which felt like a ghost town since it was past midnight. We ensured no one was around before we hopped the fence into the cemetery. It wasn't completely dark, but visibility was limited to about 10 feet, so we relied on our iPhone flashlights. There didn't seem to be any nighttime security in the cemetery, so we dispersed a bit. Ryan seemed to stick closer to Mike, and I could still see their flashlights in the distance. I wandered off on my own, wanting to capture some creepy footage. I began recording with my flashlight on, filming old headstones and the eerie atmosphere of the cemetery at night. When I noticed Mike and Ryan were no longer in sight, I started searching for them while still recording. As I looked at my phone screen, I froze in shock. There was a woman dressed in a white gown with long gray hair staring down at the ground. When I looked up to see her in person, she vanished. Feeling uneasy, I backed away and glanced back at my phone. There she was again, but this time she was looking directly at the camera, or rather at me. I glanced up and she had disappeared once more. Looking back at my screen, I could see her moving closer. Panicking, I screamed for Mike and Ryan as I sprinted away from that spot. I couldn't see their flashlights anywhere, and they didn't respond to my calls. I suspected they were trying to scare me, so I ran back to the fence of the cemetery to escape. I reached Ryan's car and texted both of them to get out of the cemetery immediately. They arrived at the car a few minutes later. We all sat inside, and I showed them the video I had taken. The horror on their faces matched mine as I replayed the footage. We could clearly see the moment the woman lifted her head from looking at the ground and then began to move toward me. Her movement lasted only a second or two before I screamed in the video and bolted away. What struck us was that she seemed to be floating as there was no visible leg movement. I still have that video saved on my old iPhone 4S, but unfortunately, the device won't turn on. It gets stuck on the Apple logo. I'm reluctant to reset the phone until I can retrieve that video somehow. My friends firmly believe the woman in the video was a living person who happened to be in the cemetery that night. However, as the one who actually encountered her and could only see her on my phone screen, let's just say that I was never a believer in the paranormal until that night.